Hello, and thank you everybody for attending this lecture. My first ever public lecture online with such a large audience. I can safely say I've never spoken to so many people over the web before, and probably never spoken to this many people except if they were a captive audience. My talk today on fantastic microbes and where to find them is based on not a single line of work I've done, but things I've encountered as a historian of science and a scientist, where I've found scientists using fantasy literature, fantasy works of fantasy and public and popular culture in order to, for various purposes in their science, as explanations, as ways to speculate, as a way to test out their ideas, and sometimes, as I'll try and show you at the end, just for fun. So I'll begin with a riff on The Walrus and the Carpenter from Alice in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll. I'll tell you more about exactly where this riff itself came from later, but for now I'm focusing on that last larger word, speculations. So rather than shoes and ships and sealing wax, the time has come, the walrus said, to talk of applications, of uses of the microscope in our investigations, and to take a peek at things that were our former speculations. So here is a form of speculation, example of using fantastic microbes, so to speak, in a speculative manner. So in 1935, December, Christopher Andrews, a British virologist, wrote to Peyton Rous, an American pathologist and a friend and colleague, where he said, "I greatly look forward to the Harvey lecture. If you let yourself go on that, I can let myself go too, but not publicly. The ideas are rather woolly for public demonstration, but as it will be nearly Christmas when this letter arrives, I will present them as a Christmas story for oncologists." Now, before I unpack this letter, I should give you a little bit of background. Peyton Rous, back in 1911, made this discovery, and he found evidence for the involvement of viruses causing sarcoma tumors in hens. A worried farm, soon after he joined the Rockefeller University in New York, a worried farmer brought this bird with a hitherto unseen tumor. And this, on experimenting with the tumor, Rous had found that it was transmissible to new birds if you used not only bits of tissue, but even cell-free extracts of the tissue. Now, this is the kind of way one at the time, or even today, confirmed that bacteria caused infections, how one pinpointed a particular bacterium to a particular infection. And based on these experiments, he couldn't find anything in these cell-free extracts, couldn't see anything under an ordinary microscope. And so he suggested that the causative agent was a virus, that is to say, such a tiny being and invisible under an ordinary microscope that was causing this cancer, that was the instigator of this particular sarcoma. Well, the cancer research community and oncologists, or oncologists as they were said, reacted quite negatively to Rous's suggestion. In fact, later, years later, 1966, he would say, the findings with the sarcoma were met with downright disbelief. The reasons, not entirely unjustified, was their belief that cancer was not an infectious disease. There's no the kind of stigma that could be attached to certain kinds of infectious disease, especially the sexual transmitted diseases, but in general, transmitted diseases was not something they wished to take on as a community. And since it was not an infectious disease, it could not be caused by a virus. This is 1911. Rous was unable to find anything that looked like a virus. Nobody knew what a virus looked like. And moreover, he was unable to find any parallel situations, parallel kinds of tumors in animals or humans, especially, which was another reason the oncologists were not particularly interested in what he had to say. He himself moved on to other research by 1915. He had quit the cancer research problem, but maintained an interest. In addition to maintaining an interest, he also maintained the tissue and sent it out to whomsoever asked to conduct further experiments with it. He received one such request in 1923 from William Guy, who was one of the first supporters of the virus theory. And when Guy sent the request, he reported on a lot of his intended experiments and his findings, and the two of them struck up a correspondence that lasted a good deal longer. 2 years after this, in 25, he reported evidence, or what he thought was evidence, in the Lancet for viral identity of the sarcoma agent. And while his findings weren't exactly confirmed, he was a prominent enough member of the cancer research community this side of the pond, and revived a much wider interest and an enduring interest and investigations into the subject of the chicken sarcoma. So while Rous did not return to it, he maintained a correspondence with Guy, and just shortly before his Harvey lecture, in the 1935 lecture that I mentioned in an earlier slide, he actually wrote, or just around that time, he wrote to Guy once saying, "Do be critical of my ideas. We are the three musketeers, you know, and we must carry something more than blunderbusses." Blunderbusses being those untargeted, old-fashioned pistols that just blew something wide open without targeting any, so without being very specific or particularly refined. Now he said three musketeers, and the third of those musketeers was the aforementioned Christopher Andrews, who had become friendly with Rous when working at the Rockefeller between 1923 to 25 as part of the rheumatic fever service. He was part of a group that went over from England to the US. He actually, upon his return, worked with Guy and was initiated into the avian sarcoma problem by Guy. And he was a bona fide virologist, worked with a great many different viruses, famously found the causative agent was part of the team that found the causative agent for influenza viruses. And much later in life, in 1970, he published a book, which I happen to have sitting next to me, on viruses and cancer. So he was the he was the virologist in the Three Musketeers. And it was due to this that he speculated often. So while he didn't necessarily work exclusively on the cancer problem, he certainly gave it a great deal of thought. And which is why, as he told Rous in that letter just before Rous's Harvey lecture, incidentally, is an annual invited lecture, quite an honor to be invited to give it by a researcher in and around New York. Usually the Harvey Society is based in New York, named for William Harvey, the scientist who in the late Middle Ages discovered that blood circulated. So he talks about this. The ideas are rather woolly for public demonstration. And in fact, just a year before he presented these ideas, this Christmas fairy tale that I'm about to tell you about to Rous in 1935, in 1934, he delivered a public address to the Royal College of Surgeons, and where he talked about specifically viruses in relation to the etiology of tumors, where he actually said, when talking about different ideas, in our present state of knowledge, it seems wiser on the whole to confine our speculations to less fantastic channels. So I should say here that, in fact, in addition to the Harry Potter allusion of the title, in the title of this talk, the word fantastic was definitely a tie-in and was borrowed or inspired by the fact that it's what Andrews used in his ideas, that he needed to look for less fantastic channels. But by the following year, he was fantasizing, and he created this Christmas story for oncologists. So I've cut and paste a few excerpts from the actual letter, the story, a copy of which I found in the archives of Rous's papers at the American Philosophical Society in New York. And it's never actually been, or it was never published, because Andrews did not intend it for publication in his lifetime. But as you can see, he actually says in the left-hand upper corner, a sprig of holly to be drawn here. So I supplied one of my, on my own. And very quickly, once upon a time, there was a family of viruses, and I'll only read excerpts. I'll leave it on long enough for those who want to read it all. But he talks about their multiplication. After a while, most homes got broken up and viruses had to seek new ones in new hosts. And these new homes, they penetrated by means of powerful tusks in their upper jaws. I added this part because tusks, he also uses the metaphor of teeth. And this shows up later, as you will see. He goes on to talk about how the hosts reacted. They weren't too pleased, but they made a deal, and they said they made terms with the enemy and said, come right in, live in our cells, but you must practice birth control and leave our furniture alone. If you may, and if you do that, you may even come into the inner sanctum of our germplasm and be tolerated, etc. Now there's an asterisk where he adds this funny bit about Hans Andersen's version and Grimm having a slightly different version. And mostly this was to talk about two competing theories, and why he chose one over the other doesn't really have too much to do with the fairy tales. He chose Andersen's identity, it would seem, because of its anagram of his initials with Andersen's own. Hans Andersen, Christian H.A.C., Christopher H. Andrews. So, but the main thing is here, he's speculating on how viruses were able to enter the genome, or the germplasm, as they called it then, of the host cell, become a part of it, and therefore not cause disease any longer. And this was at the time very fantastical, which is why he didn't really say anything. There was no way to test it. But in very short order, very few years later, 1939, he already propounded this theory in a public lecture, in a presidential address, where he talked about latent virus infections and their possible relevance to the cancer problem, and brought up that notion of tusks, or he mentions tusks, but then calls them toothless viruses, where viruses which cannot be demonstrated directly, but only by roundabout means. So here was an example where he used this fairy tale, created these fantastical viruses with tusks or without tusks, and used it as a means of speculating about the mechanism by which viruses cause cancer. I now move on to a couple of examples. And as a postscript, 1966, 55 years after Rous had received his, discovered the sarcoma agent, proposed that it was a virus, he actually did go on to receive the Nobel Prize, cited specifically for his discovery of tumor-inducing viruses. Makes him, it still holds the record for the largest gap between discovery and the prize. It's also one of the few, among the more senior of the people to receive the prize. Had he not got it then, he would have died. He died 3 years after receiving this in his 90s. So that's just a quick postscript. So speculations turned out to have a lot of muscle after all. The next part is fantastic microbes and what is called Aliceology. In a recent publication, a Japanese medical researcher, Hisato Takagi, identified no fewer than 20 medical science articles that explicitly played on the title Alice in Wonderland in some form or another to talk about their own subject, and several others which quoted either signature phrases or characters from Lewis Carroll's novel in order to make a point as a metaphor or as a simile. I'm going to talk about two of, and he's who used the term Aliceology, though I don't believe he coined it. I'm going to very briefly refer to two where the fantastic microbes come in. The first is a 1938 article, again, a public lecture called Alice in Virusland, delivered to the American Society of Bacteriologists in 1938, and where he adds this short parenthetical note preface. My apologies to Lewis Carroll with the hope that he will extend his usual gracious blessing to this latest parody on the immortal Alice. And it's supplemented with figures. There's one, the one to the left is Alice's first meeting with the virus. And in the second, it's in a court, sitting in a parliament, much like the court of the Queen of Hearts, where Alice is representing the human race before the tribunal of the microbe parliament. So it's a very, very long lecture, but it basically follows the Alice story where she eats something she's not supposed to, shrinks in size, and meets all these various microbes. In it is a riff, a very different riff than I'd quoted earlier, on the walrus and the carpenter, called the Coccus and the Spirochaete. Cocci being these really small, round, spherical bacteria, and the spirochetes are spiral-shaped ones, often implicated, the specific one implicated in syphilis, for example. Coccus includes those that strep throat staphylococcus, which is another organism, in pimples. And I'm just quoting, not entirely at random, but from inside the poem, not from the beginning or the end, because, well, I thought this one made, one of them refers to a virus, but also it's to be borne in mind, this 1938, I don't know if he knew then, probably had, world was on the brink of World War II, and this is his poem. But wait a bit, the Coccus cried, deciphering his notes. This human race is surely mad. They slit each other's throats. They blow each other off the earth. They sink each other's boats. And a couple of stanzas later, he goes on to speak influenza virus then. Let's smite them hip and thigh. They're clever, strong, and hard to beat, but smack them in the eye. If we combine in our attack, surely they must die. His choice of influenza is very apt, because the influenza pandemic, Spanish flu in World War I, 1918 through 1919, killed more people, had more, claimed more lives than the war-related casualties of World Wars I and II put together. So I just wanted to quote from that because it was particularly apt in the Society of Microbes. The second Aliceology example, a few years later, 1943, is by this Hungarian scientist, Ladislaus Martin, a pioneer of electron microscopy, who actually pioneer not just of electron microscopy, of applying electron microscopy to biological subjects. At the time, his original work was in Belgium. By the time he gave this particular lecture that I'm about to mention, the Alice allusion, was in a lecture, once again, a public lecture, to the Sigma Psi Society, a scholarly honor society in the United States. And he picked on this particular metaphor, as he later described, to present a new subject, as electron microscopy was at the time. And he resorted to what he called quasi-poetical license. And he created Alice in Electronland. And he posed it as though it were an unknown manuscript that he discovered and edited, along with the help of his wife, Mrs. Martin, and a colleague, Sidney Rous. And again, it shares a certain qualities with the original story, as well as with Alice in Virusland, where Alice shrinks, drinking something that she's not supposed to, and encounters various organisms. In this case, very specifically, and so that's what he's talking about. The time has come, the walrus said, to talk of applications and the uses of the microscope in our investigations. Again, this walrus and the carpenter poem is embedded into the lecture, and the microscope being the applications in this case. So this is using the fantastic microbes as a way of explanation. The bacteria he mentions in Electronland included Aunt Henrietta, which were spores of Bacillus subtilis. He gives them all names. Joe Strep, which is the dangerous streptococci that I'd mentioned that cause the throat infections, and Francis Thioba, a soil bacterium. And then viruses, he describes youngsters of the flu family belonging to, he calls it possibly producing influenza, and the sons of Toby Mosaic, the tobacco mosaic virus, which is the first virus ever to be discovered. So these were various fantastic microbes that Alice encountered while in Electronland. And again, this was used to very much self-consciously as a way to explain, talk about the applications of a new instrument, a new piece of technology that had only recently begun to be used by biological scientists. I'll now move on from Electronland back to Christopher Andrews, who many, many years later used the same kind of humor, but this time published it in both for explanatory purposes and to make a commentary on the kind of science. This instance, he was very specifically asked to contribute an article to a coronation edition of St. Bartholomew's Hospital journal, and he published one with the title, "Is Sex Infectious?" It was very specifically, he himself would mention in the paper, in the commentary, it was derived from or inspired by these particular publications earlier that same year, 1953, observations on a transmissible agent determining sexual differentiation in bacterium, and then a second paper by Cavalli and the Lederbergs, Joshua and Esther Lederberg, infective factor controlling sex compatibility in Bacterium coli. This one was not written in the form of a fairy tale, but very self-consciously, he almost channeled someone called Damon Runyon, who may or may not be familiar to this audience. Damon Runyon was a Broadway author. He wrote several short stories and Broadway plays. And eventually, after this, not at the time he hadn't published it yet, but he's the author of the famous musical Guys and Dolls. And he has a very distinctive kind of voice that I, for the life of me, cannot repeat. And it's my fantasy that someday somebody will read out this Christopher Andrews' entire story as though they were acting in a Broadway play, but that's for another time. But in it, he created these characters, again, fantastic microbes, a bacterium that he called Plato the Pure, who's autotrophic. He lives in primeval slime, only propagated by binary fission because all his thoughts were pure, and the idea of kissing a doll, bang, smush on the dark night never entered his noggin because he had no noggin and there were no dolls. But he was happy in the primeval slime whenever he was hungry, until one day he was afflicted with this other character called Percy the Pimp, which is a bacteriophage, viruses that specifically infect only bacteria. And once again, he says, Percy the Pimp concocts a plan to make themselves more acceptable to the bacterial cell by disguising themselves in genes. Interestingly, once again, in his parody, he returned to the same mechanism that he'd speculated on several, decades earlier in his fairy tale to Rous, except here now he was actually talking about ways that people were actually thinking about how this particular mechanism, how people knew, or were beginning to find. Yes, in 1953, people knew that a bacteriophage integrated itself into the bacterial genome, became part of the DNA, disguising themselves in their genes. So again, he took some very basic science, incorporated it, and made it exceedingly funny. If one can hear in their head a nasal Long Island accent saying, one day, a particularly nasty phage. Yeah, that's what comes to mind. So he really did a great job of, again, incorporating fantasy and popular culture literature and hard science. So moving on, finally, I'm going to make a very brief allusion to fantastic microbes in or from Leeds. Actually, the same scientific event about bacteria having sex is alluded to here. And this is a 1977 publication in a journal with no explanation or context, called A Genetic Ode or Melancholy Tale by Donald Nicholson, who I understand died only a few years ago and taught at the Department of Microbiology, famous for creating metabolic pathways. And again, I cannot read out the whole poem, much as I would love to, but I am going to reproduce the very last paragraph here. I mean, it begins with, I used to be a coli, as wild could be. And he talks about being shot with UV rays and what happens to him as a result of that, losing a certain gene and losing the ability to process certain kinds of foods. But he ends, therefore, and with the stanza, be warned, O human beings, by this melancholy ode. You who think you are so clever, cracking our genetic code. There's a moral in the story, and I'll tell you what it means. And he actually put this in all caps in block letters himself. If you strip too much to sunbathe, you may lose a pair of jeans. Why he wrote this, there was no context for this, and one could say he did it purely for fun. And one person, when I was talking about this, somebody who's not a scientist, who's a literary theorist, said, well, I was just being frivolous or superficial. But I happen to think that fun is serious business in doing science, that levity helps us process things better. And my own example, I encountered this poem when I was an undergraduate student in the 1980s, mid-1980s in India. And until a few years ago, I didn't know who the author was. I just encountered it and it's made me laugh out loud. And, you know, it kept me in microbiology probably long after, because I wanted to make bacteria lose their genes, so to speak. So there is a sort of serious side to having fun, but fantasy certainly is not just something we scientists use at whim, but they often use it for very serious scientific purposes. I hope I haven't run over time. I'll end now. I want to say a special thank you to Dr. Sania Saftic, who was a colleague of mine in my microbiology days, not my undergraduate days, and who is a cartoonist beyond compare. She creates, and I was allowed to use many of her cartoon images of the various bacteria. If you want to see more of those, her website, biotoon.com. Please visit the website on your own time. I would especially like to thank everybody at the University of Leeds through this, who supported me through this difficult time and made this public lecture possible, even despite all the hurdles, including recording this. And finally, of course, to thank you all for this very fantastic opportunity. Wish you good evening.